Welcome to Off the Couch, where psychology meets everyday life. I'm Dr. Greg Cason, here with producer Brian Gomez.
Happy Monday, you guys.
And our other on the board, Tony Sweet. Hi, Tony.
Hello.
It's so good to see you. This week on Off the Couch, we're going to talk about something special. Can we trust our own beliefs? What do you think? We can trust our own beliefs? Ooh. Well, we're going to talk about that. And our stories are, is it better to scare people or sell them hope? We've been seeing a lot of this in the political campaigns, but this was specifically done around vaccines. So interesting study. Also, can people trick us into believing something? And are we right about people we think have wrong views? You know, we're always judging people who think differently than us. And I think this is a little bit of a surprise finding, or at least I was a little bit surprised. And then for psychology in the news, we're going to talk about when being mean finally goes too far. But first, when I looked at this, I had to look back at these studies that I selected, and they all had to center around something called attitudes. And attitudes are a settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something, and it's typically related to someone's behavior. I actually did my dissertation on attitude change. I have a lot of interest in this. Attitudes are really these more solidified beliefs that we have about things. So they're not the really simple beliefs. They're the solidified beliefs, but they don't always lead to behavior, because we can have a negative attitude about a group of people or something, but we still may not do something about it. But it still means that we have that attitude. So that's basically what we're going to be talking about. So let's talk. Is it better to scare people or give them hope?
You were talking about the vaccinations about that, or
that's what our study is going to be.
So I'm like, both would work. I would say it just depends on what the outcome you want to get from.
What do you think? There might be different outcomes?
Yeah, for hope and fear is a whole different thing.
Well, it's interesting you say that. This is not what the study's about, but just to kind of touch on what you just said, there are some studies that show that medications and vaccines actually work better when people believe in their efficaciousness, and they believe they work.
Oh, that makes sense.
So when you believe it works better. And when you don't believe it works, or you believe it has harmful side effects, you feel more harmful side effects. You've got to find that a little bit trippy. The people actually convince their bodies to work better, and they convince their bodies to feel more side effects.
That makes sense, though. I mean, if you're scared because of the side effects or what's going to happen, if for a vaccine, for example, your body might go into this fearful or shocked kind of state where it's kind of harder for the vaccine or anything to actually go through your body, and process it.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe that's exactly what's going on.
It would happen.
Isn't that where people can make themselves depressed? People can make themselves not feel good. People are like, oh, you don't look good. And then after a while, you're like, maybe I don't feel that good.
The second someone tells me I don't look good, I instantly have to go look in the mirror to think, what's going on here?
See?
It always surprises me people say that, though. Do you ever say that to somebody?
Every day.
Oh.
I was kidding. No, I'm kidding.
So let's talk about vaccines. Vaccines are really where this is at. Vaccines are the most economical and effective public health strategy for reducing morbidity and mortality. That's what the study said. Do you guys know what morbidity and mortality is? I had to learn this when I was doing research. Just in my 20s, I was working at UCLA doing HIV research, and we had to review the morbidity and the CDC's morbidity and mortality report. I think it was released every week, and it would tell these things. Morbidity is not the same as mortality. Mortality is death rates, actually dying. Morbidity is disease rates. So it's basically when you go, morbidity is referring to having a disease or having some kind of illness. So we know that vaccines actually reduce both illness and they reduce death. So this is pretty good, and they're pretty cheap, and they're pretty effective. But we have something called vaccine hesitancy, which I find like a very odd term, because it really is people who are just refuse to get vaccines for a number of reasons. Sometimes the hesitant will go ahead and get a vaccine, but most people with vaccine hesitancy translate to not getting a vaccine. And this is usually due to misinformation and ignorance. So public health officials in China wanted to investigate this. I love this. So they investigated the effectiveness of various messaging strategies to induce people to get vaccinated for COVID-19. I find this also interesting because their vaccine wasn't quite as good as ours here in the U.S. But nonetheless, they wanted to see what would work to get people to take the vaccine. So they had 3 experimental groups and 1 control group. Do you guys remember what a control group is? A experimental group, you're actually doing something, but a control group, you're basically trying to measure people if they didn't have the intervention. So basically a control group is what you're just trying to hold, what normal people would just normally do without these additional measures used. So you're just trying to figure it out. Sometimes you actually give somebody something, a control group in a medication studies, you give them some kind of pill that means nothing, like a little sugar pill. And then you give the pill that looks exactly the same to the experimental group with the actual medication inside. So people don't know which one they're getting. That's kind of how it's done. So that's a control group. And then the experimental group, you actually get the medicine or something like that. So what do you think? What do you guys think would influence you? I'm gonna say the 3 groups, and you guys think about it for yourselves, okay?
Okie dokie.
So the messaging strategies tested were group 1, personal benefits of vaccination. The message was, vaccination can make you develop antibodies against COVID-19, reducing the likelihood of contracting COVID-19 and developing severe symptoms. That's group 1.
Okay.
Group 2, it's the benefits of others group. The vaccine can promote herd immunity, reducing the likelihood of community members getting infected and developing severe symptoms. And group 3 is the potential harm of not vaccinating. The message is, if you are not vaccinated, you will be more susceptible to COVID-19 and more likely to develop severe symptoms. What do you think? Personal benefits of vaccination, they make things better. Benefits to others, it makes other people less likely to get sick, or potential harm of you not getting vaccinated and you contracting a worse illness?
For me, it's like the personal benefit. I know it's selfish, but I just don't like getting sick. So if I can avoid it, I will do that one for sure.
Okay, so you're more personal benefits. Okay, good.
I honestly, knock on wood, I don't take a lot of vaccinations, like the flu shots and stuff like that. And I rarely ever get sick.
Same here.
So for me, I don't like taking vaccines. I'm not anti-vax. Put that on the record. But I don't like taking vaccines because I feel like a lot of people, like my mom and dad, used to get the flu shot and they would get sick afterwards. And I was just like, if I'm not getting sick and I don't, maybe when I get a little older, I would start taking more vaccines. So I think number 3.
Potential harm of not being vaccinated. That is if you're not vaccinated, you'll be more susceptible to COVID-19 and more likely to develop severe symptoms. So that, so it's only when it's the harm might be pretty bad that you might consider it. Like a flu, you can survive, but COVID-19 might be much worse.
Right.
So, okay, good.
It just depends on the vaccine. Yes.
Okay, no, that's very interesting. By the way, people that usually get ill around a vaccine after getting it, they're usually having a mounting the side effects essentially are what making them ill, because their body is mounting an immune response that starts to mimic the symptoms of the illness usually.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to be 55 and I don't think I remember the last time I got the flu. Maybe 40 years ago.
Dude, you're amazing.
So
that's amazing.
I feel the same way though. I don't really get the flu shot because I try so much to stay healthy as it is that I feel like if you just do your best, with your own body, you can beat a lot of things just floating around like
Yeah.
that, you know.
I am like a dog. I get all my shots, and I get them on schedule. So
Yeah.
I'm a human pincushion. I'm good with it.
I've
And it
heard
keeps
that.
me going.
Everybody's got their own thing, you know.
Everybody's got one. So good. That's very interesting. Tony, you're in the biggest group.
Oh.
The avoidance
Thank
of
you.
potential harm, they had the highest probability of vaccination. This is what we call the fear group. So fear might motivate them. So only if you're actually afraid of getting it will you actually consider it, versus you can weather it if it's something like a flu. And some people flu, like if you're over 65, when you do reach that tender age, then you might want to consider the flu shot, because
That's probably the case, yes.
that's when it starts to really take people down. The second highest group was the personal benefits group. That was Brian.
Yay.
He had they have a 65% probability of vaccination. This is the hope group. This is, they're more motivated by the positive stuff. So it's interesting. And the third group was the group that I identified with, just to let you know. I didn't want to lead it on. This is the benefits to others. I understand this about my personal psychology. This is how I work. But I guess it was interesting to see this in a study. I think that's what motivated me to even want to talk about it, because I was like, oh, I was always baffled why other people aren't motivated by this, but like a huge group of people weren't motivated by this. Protecting others is usually not people's number one thing, unless you're like a mom or like
Right.
a strange person like myself.
Yeah, I think we live in a pretty selfish society that it shows. The study's saying it.
What was also interesting here is the control group was the lowest of all. So it didn't matter what people said. It was still more effective than saying nothing at all. So it's good something is said. Whether it's you're going to die, fear, you're going to be better off, hope, or, other people will be prevented from harm. That's altruism.
Right.
So, yeah. So there you go.
Womp womp.
I mean, and also we all got vaccinated when we were born, if we were born in a hospital. So I still can't fathom some of the resistance on some of it,
Dude, we had to line up for
I remember. I still got this.
Remember those, the smallpox scars?
Did you ever get that?
I don't have the scar, but like in the military, every time we had scheduled stuff there, we would get flu shots all the time. Like anything, sometimes I don't even know what we were getting shot with, but we would just stand in line and boop, boop.
You're like,
boop,
sure.
boop. Yeah.
I was worried when I was
We
a
didn't have a
kid
choice.
that my smallpox vaccination didn't work because my scar didn't last forever. Some people's last a lifetime. Mine kind of healed up.
I've never had chickenpox, by the way.
Oh, the
Really?
Wow.
chickenpox is a different thing. By the way, you need to get vaccinated for that because you don't want it as an adult.
That's what I hear.
You really don't want it as an adult. So that would be a good thing to get vaccinated for.
Well, I'm pretty sure I have been.
Oh,
I just never
from the
got it.
military?
Yeah, I just never had chickenpox as a
Oh,
kid.
well, if you've been vaccinated, then you probably
okay.
wouldn't get it. Yeah. Yeah, I had chickenpox. I had mumps. I had measles. I had all of them.
I'm a kid.
I hear that was very common back in the day.
It was. It's more like everybody in your class would get it, and we would just stay home and heal and go back to school.
Oh, but mumps, I remember answering the door and I had this, giant, sweltering goiters, hanging off my...
Goiter.
Like giant things hanging off my chin. I looked like a frog blowing up. And I remember
I wanna see a
answering
picture.
the door and the person gasping. And I can't even remember who it was. It was probably some neighbor coming by.
What did they do to you?
Like, oh my God. But yeah, but I take it personally too, because my brother, the reason my brother who is intellectually disabled, he's very severely, he got that from high fever and rubella. I mean, he actually got ill and had brain damage as a result. Wow. So it wasn't just a willy-nilly thing. So these are serious things, and the vaccines didn't exist back then.
And I can see where that would shape your point of view on every vaccination from then on.
I'm all for it.
Yeah.
But I also had a friend who's got Guillain-Barré syndrome, and that's the severe response you can have to a vaccine or a cold or virus. I mean, it doesn't even have to be a vaccine. It can be any one of these things that leads to about a full year of paralysis. Oh, wow. And it takes a while. You mean at first it gets very severe, and then they have to climb out of it. But it's a very, very disabling syndrome that people have. They can't work. I mean, it's just a horrible thing to happen. And if you read your disclosure whenever you get a vaccine, they're always going to disclose you may get Guillain-Barré. That's what that is. It's a pretty serious thing. So I guess for those of you who are fear motivated, Tony, you might want to stay. That would keep you away. But he's doing very well now. He has a beautiful wife and children, lives in a beautiful house. So, yeah, he's doing very well. But okay, so let's talk. Can people trick us into believing something? What do you think?
We see that now in politics.
It's history.
Well, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about cognitive biases. A cognitive bias is a filter through which we interpret information. And there is a particular cognitive bias I'm going to talk about, but let me just introduce this. It's a repetition bias, by the way. I'll just give away that name. So the repetition bias is repeated information bombards us daily, and actually you're right, Tony. Politics, advertising, religious teachings. I even had an example like when your mother's saying you don't have a complete family until you have children, or something like that. Sometimes you can hear repetition bias in your own family, and you can start to believe those things. So repetition bias is not necessarily true, but we start to believe it. So it bombards us daily. And University of Surrey did a study uncovering cognitive bias affecting rational decision making. So we know already that repetition leads to an overestimation of information's importance. And when we see it many times, we think, that's important information. But they didn't know absolutely whether it changed people's minds. Actually, I mean, maybe they did because there have been other studies, but nonetheless, participants were over 200 individuals involved in decision-making tasks. They took 200 people. They exposed them to repeated information without telling people they were being exposed to repeated information. So they would give them stuff and then repeat the information every now and then from something else. And they found the bias actually started to take hold, the repetition bias. It's sometimes called the illusory truth effect, just so you know. It's like we start to believe something's true because we see it a lot.
That sounds fancy.
Yeah. And this is usually compounded with something we called motivated reasoning. This is another cognitive bias. We tend to be attracted to information that already confirms our belief, which is confirmation bias. You guys don't really want to know everything like that, do you? But not as interesting. Not as interesting. But what it does tell us is we have these filters, these lenses, and we need to understand these lenses because we need to understand what's happening to us, and it is happening to us when it comes to politics, especially. I'm hearing a lot of it right now, and I'm hearing flat out lies repeated over and over and over again, like by the same person in the same 3-minute segment on a news program, just repeating things over and over and over again. And you're like, what? And the journalists will kind of push back, and they push back kind of in a weak way usually. Oh, well, that's a misstatement, or that's not what they said. And they just push it. And now here's why. Because repeated information is perceived as new and more important. So people start to go, wait a minute, that must be true. It leads us to irrational decision making and causes us to make errors in how our decisions are formed. There's another study also proved this. This was just happened here in August. This was a study that was released in August in a journal called PLOS One. And this is from Australian National University and good old USC here in LA. The climate science, they did a thing on climate science, and they were trying to they wanted to assess people who are climate science supporters and climate skeptics. They did this wide sample of people, and they found that 90% of people were climate science supporters. This may be because it's an Australian study as opposed to an American study, but nonetheless, I mean, although USC helped co-sponsor the study, but I think the population's all Australia. But they found 90% were client science supporters. And so they really couldn't look at cleanly client skeptics. But when we look at client science supporters, they rated climate skeptical statements as truer when they had just one single repetition of incorrect information. Does that make sense? Like when they're told something incorrect about climate science, they start to believe it after just one time. This was even true in people who were alarmed about climate change. People who thought, oh my God, the climate change is going to be the worst thing possible. And then you say, well, and you can just tell them some sort of, how do we know those studies are accurate? Doesn't weather come and go, which is different than climate? Well, my dad will always say, how is there global warming when it's so cold outside? And I'm like, oh my God, is this real?
Lot, yeah.
But
I hear that a lot.
Hi, Dad. I know he listens.
Hi, Dad.
But he's heard me push back on him. Okay, so implications of the study. Repetition in media and campaigns can manipulate public opinion. Marketing and political dangers are really the big ones. Religion too, perhaps, because some people feel like they're told that they're bad people by their religion, and they believe that. And that might even lead them to commit suicide or become drug addicts or do something else. So there are very big implications to being told the same thing over and over that can be rather damaging. And we need to recognize this is a bias, and it's crucial for more rational decision making. Interesting stuff, huh?
Yes. That's
okay.
Charles Manson.
So we know we judge people who think in opposition to our beliefs. Here I was doing that about, my own father. I apologize, Dad. That sometimes people believe something different than we do. But are we right about people we think have wrong views? Are we the correct ones?
No, I mean, I feel like we talked about this last time.
We
did? A while back on how when people think a certain way and they don't think like the common sense way that I would think.
That's common sense, yeah.
That it's like, I can't really hate them or anything because they're not doing things exactly the way I would think it should be done, I think you made a good point with making it like the religion topic of it, where it's like, I wouldn't want somebody to force me to do something like what they follow within their religion if I'm not religious at all or anything like that, And that kind of put in like a good point of view where it's like, you can't force somebody to act and do and like the same things you do,
You cannot force it, but it really struck me about that previous study we talked about. Like if you move to a community where everyone believed the same thing, like so-and-so is the town slut, you might believe that too.
Well, that's what I learned in the military from working with different people from around the world, that most of those people have only been exposed to that little part of their town, and that's all they know. And they usually go from high school, from that small town, and all they've ever known into the military, and that's all they've ever known their entire life. So they have that point of view of what they grew up with and have never been exposed to other people from different races, different backgrounds, different likes or anything like that. So yeah, you can't really fault them. I just look at it like they've just never been exposed to other things or more.
Yeah. I grew up in a small town in Kansas, so when I grew up, I mean, I think it's more changed a little bit now, but when I grew up, there were several people in my hometown that were my friends of my family, my father's friends, that I think Oklahoma was the only state they had been into outside of Kansas at that time, at least. So if you think about pretty much all white, Christian, base, Bible Belt that didn't even, because I hear people talk, oh, California. Have you ever been to California? And, well, no, but, that's so all you've heard about California is from other people and their anger and hatred towards, California. So
it's shocking. So it's good you moved out here, but aren't you a little bit convinced that those negative campaigns about California are put out by Californians who don't want anyone more to move here?
True.
Because
when I moved here 20-some years ago, they're like, all these people from the other states are moving to California. Yeah. So
it's a lot of people.
Yeah.
When I moved to Texas my 8th grade year from San Diego, that was a huge culture shock. I thought I was going to be riding horses to school. So that goes to show, like, that's what all I knew about Texas is, like, riding horses. And that's not what it was.
So that's not what I expected this discussion to be. But, how interesting it made me think of, like, when I went to Texas, I went there very specifically for grad school because I wanted to be in a place. There were several reasons, but I really wanted to be in a place that I didn't know the culture. Like, I wanted to learn the culture too. And I thought the South or the North, or, like Midwest or maybe Northeast, which I knew a little bit already at that point. But I was more like thinking along those lines because I felt like I needed to expand my horizons. And when I did my fellowship, my second fellowship I did in New York City at the Albert Ellis Institute, and there were 10 of us, I believe, 8 or 10 of us. I have to go back and look. I think it was 10. But only 3 of us were from the United States.
Oh.
And we were literally West Coast, middle of the country, who was from Texas, and East Coast. Isn't that wild?
Interesting.
Yeah. So they literally looked at regions, and and the rest of the people were from other countries, and all around the world, which I thought was so cool. And I got to be exposed to all these people.
You learn. I think it's cool.
Yeah.
I do too.
I actually loved it. So this study was done at King's College in London and University of Oxford. This is published in Scientific Reports. They took 256 participants in the United States. The British are studying us like we're mice in a maze. So they took 256 participants in the U.S. that were split between left-leaning and right-leaning political views, which isn't too hard to find here, I think. And they rated agreement with political statements and predicted responses of others. So they basically said, here's a political statement that's either left or right leaning. And they go, do you agree with this or not agree with this? And then they would take someone who was the opposite of their view, and they would say, they would tell us about somebody else, like who was different than them, and they'd say, how do you think they'll react to this? And then they would have to rate. But they did this study in kind of an interesting way. I won't go into it completely, but they gave them lots of chances to find out more and more and more about the people they didn't know. Were the people that were just like themselves, they go, this person's just like you. They didn't give them any more information. Like, this person's just like you. But if you want to know more about this person, we'll tell you. And they told them more things, like they gave them more things. So realize that people were working with more information with the people who were different than themselves. So that's just important to know. They deem these two groups, in-group and out-group. So your in-group are people just like you, and your out-group are people different than you. So think about who those people are. Brian is always saying that I'm different than he is.
We are. Very.
He says I need a brain transplant.
Oh, he does have a boy brain.
He said that earlier today.
You have a what brain?
Boy brain.
Oh, that's fun.
I call it like a frat boy brain.
I mean, maybe I do, because I did really like, parties in college. Yeah.
I feel like I have like a woman's brain in that sense. So that's why that's our little differences.
It's why I appreciate your point of view, because you highlight things I wasn't thinking of. Common sense in your mind.
I would definitely be the boy brain myself. So
Tony, we can hang out and be stupid together. Right. So, okay, we know our own people. This is the bottom line of this study. We know our own people. People accurately predicted responses of their in-group members with less information. So they weren't given information about their own people, and they would guess their answers correctly. This person said the same thing you did. Oh, well, then they're going to say this on this and this on this and this on this. Like, they would be very good about it. But the study found we're really bad at knowing people who are not like us. When they would have someone who didn't answer that question the same way, they couldn't figure out how they would answer on other questions. They'd make assumptions about them, and they mostly got them wrong. And they had these predictions for the outgroup members were consistently wrong, because people said, oh, I know how that person thinks. I know how that liberal, I know how that conservative person thinks. And then they would guess, they'd be super high confident, and then they'd be wrong. So, and then they found out more information about the person, and they still got it wrong. So what does this tell us? This tells us that people, stick to your own. But it doesn't, that confidence does not equal accuracy when we think we know what other people think. So if we're watching one of the conventions, the Republican National Convention or the Democratic National Convention, do you ever notice, too, that people who don't like Democrats say the Democrat National Convention? It's a subtle verbal thing, which I've found kind of interesting, because Democratic is the adjective, but they don't want to say Democratic for Democrats, I guess, because they say Democrat.
Or do they just not know?
No, I watched it change in language, because you know me, I'm a weirdo student of language sometimes. And I was like, that is the weirdest change, but I see what they're doing. It seemed pretty obvious that they don't want to use that word Democratic to be associated with Democrats. I think is the bottom line. So anyway, if you're watching one of those conventions and you're a big fan of that convention, and then you watch the other convention, you think, those people, they're this and that, or they think this and that, you're probably wrong.
Well,
okay. It's best to remain curious about people unlike ourselves, and to remain curious, and don't assume. Don't assume. When you assume, what?
I like to make an ass out of myself.
Ass out of you and me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That goes the dad joke.
I do. I am. That is essentially yes. Okay, now we're moving to psychology in the news. This was something I wanted to get to. We didn't get to last week, but it's understanding Gus Walz's journey. If any of you watched the Democratic National Convention, you saw this scene when Tim Walz was giving his acceptance speech for the nomination for vice president, the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party.
And when our daughter was born, we named her Hope. Hope, Gus, and Gwen, you are my entire world, and I love you.
It is hard not to watch that, or hard to watch that and not get tears in your eyes. That is the most beautiful thing. Didn't you feel that, Brian?
Yeah. I mean, it's pure, like, they're just so proud. and happy.
So
for him,
proud.
you know?
Tears on all of their faces. But you saw the son stand up, crying and pointing at his dad and saying, "That's my dad. That's my dad."
That's cool because you don't really see a lot of relationships like that.
No.
You
No,
know,
there's-
most people hate their dads. So.
It's truly love in that family.
Yeah.
Truly love in that family. But then right after that happened, and I was really surprised by this. I shouldn't have been, but I was. Conservative firebrand Ann Coulter posted an article on X about Gus's emotional reaction with the lead to the photo of the teenager, that photo that you saw of Gus in tears pointing at his father. And she captioned it, "Talk about weird." And she was, and then, went on to disparage him, as a lot of other people did on the right wing, which I was really surprised by, talking about men expressing emotion, how sick it was, that these people are namby-pamby, essentially, and didn't deserve to live. And this is shocking that this even happened, and this was due to their attitudes that we were talking about today. Number one, that they think that that's some sort of weakness, which I quibble with. I don't know if they don't express emotion in their lives and the toll that probably takes in their own emotional lives and their own families and relationships, but the sort of lack of empathy, the incredible lack of empathy.
Well, I just find it disgusting where it's like, dude, that's a kid. Like, you guys are grown.
You're right. He's
old
17.
People.
He's 17 years old.
Professional people. Like,
Enough with the old.
no, I'm serious. Like, it needs to be said because, like, this is a child, pretty
And
much.
Christians.
It's
That was the biggest one for me.
the Christian. Oh God.
By saying that they're Christians, majority of the Republicans or say it's the Christian nation and but it's like to be able to use those words towards a child proud of his dad. I would think any child or any parent would love to have their child look up to them like that.
Yeah.
So
I doubt most of those kids that they're raising look
yeah,
up to them
I
like
doubt
that.
it either. So
No, I mean, there's truly is love in that family.
Yeah.
It's spilling over the top, and I was so thrilled to see that choice for the vice presidential nominee. Because, I mean, he's bringing him not only a great man, but a great family coming with him. So it just is very impressive. But this also called to mind that there is a psychological issue going here. And it's not the attitude I'm going to pick on. It's actually people's reaction to difference. And the difference Gus Walls has is something called a nonverbal learning disorder. It is also commonly abbreviated NVLD, nonverbal learning disorder. The NVLD, or nonverbal learning disorder, is characterized by a disparity between verbal abilities and nonverbal skills, such as visual spatial processing. Here you go. So it's sort of like left brain, right brain. It's sort of like you're good with words, but not so good with math and concepts, and like space bubbles and things like that. So a key statistic is it affects 3 to 8% of children in the United States, and it was first recognized in 1967. So that's relatively new in the psychology community game. So Gus, he had a very strong emotional reaction, and people with NVLD actually have more difficulty controlling their emotions. So they don't manage their emotions quite as easily, so their emotions can well up. They can experience them in a stronger way because we can tamp down our emotions.
Right.
We can put a lid on it, but, people, they're not able as much to put a lid on their emotions, and they express them. So, and his personal quote, he said, "That's my dad." So let's talk about the verbal versus nonverbal. People who have NVLD, nonverbal learning disorder, have strong vocabulary and a good memory for facts. So when you talk to somebody who has this particular disorder, you may not realize that there's any problem whatsoever. A nonverbal task, though, they might have difficulty, like reading maps, telling time, or with motor skills. So it could be something that you just don't see. It's a little bit more hidden. Their visual spatial challenges, they have trouble with pattern recognition, higher order thinking, and spatial awareness. We'll talk about what those are, but bottom line is you're going to have more problems with math and things like that. But pattern recognition, I'm going to talk about why that actually plays a role, that people with nonverbal learning disorder sometimes can have difficulty in relationships and forming relationships and friendships because of this particular thing, and the spatial awareness, like with space bubbles and things. So when kids have nonverbal learning disorder when they're young, they have differences in elementary school. It's first notice like, hey, something's off here. They can't do math. They can't do, or maybe very basic, but once you get into any kind of higher order, it becomes much more difficult. They have math and reading comprehension about things that become abstract. So they're more concrete, which means that like if you say it, that's what it is. But if you say like, can you explain to me what this saying means that a babbling brook is shallow? They might go, well, it means the brook when it's babbling is only like a couple inches deep. Rather that what that really refers to was somebody who babbles all the time, such as me today, might not be very emotionally deep. It's just like this. It's the opposite of still waters run deep, which they might have more difficulty with. So related conditions. I mean, I don't know if we need to do an assessment today. What's going on here? You guys are staring at me. Okay. It's often accompanied by ADHD, which we hear a lot about, and anxiety. So these two conditions. What's interesting to me, I mean, I could go on and on about ADHD and anxiety, but they both have a component role in emotions, and they're very related to emotion. A lot of people don't think that, and that there is probably an interplay in all of these things. So let's talk about the social impact of nonverbal learning disorder. They have social awkwardness. They have difficulty interpreting nonverbal cues, not unlike people who are autistic. This is considered an autism spectrum issue, but a lot of people consider it that. It leads to challenges in social interactions. Also, personal space. They struggle with respecting personal boundaries, and they have difficulty making friends. And this goes that pattern recognition thing. They have difficulty because they don't learn about past experiences and when they walk into a new situation. So if they're friends with you and you told them, no, you can't do that in this situation, when they're in that situation, they may still do that thing again, whatever it is, like push you. Like Julia Louis-Dreyfus would always do to Jerry Seinfeld. Do you remember that on that show? Oh, on Seinfeld? Oh, yeah. The Elaine character would always push him, but I guess he never told her no. She would say, get out, and then the person would go straight to the ground.
I do remember that, yeah.
And then is this something people are born with, or is this something that can be developed?
That's a great question. We consider this a neurological type illness, which means it might be more developmental, which means it's if you're technically more born as opposed to developed.
Okay. Because I feel like, especially with like the younger generation, that might be something that is just common,
Well, I mean, certain things can be learned and unlearned, and and I don't know about in this particular disorder. It's not an expertise of mine, so I won't venture in there. But as I won't probably with children's disorders in general, I won't go too far. I'm a babbling brook as opposed to still water on that particular issue. But I will say that you can learn skills to help override things, and that's part of the treatment that this happens. One of Gus's strengths is he's described as brilliant and hyper aware of details by his family. So he really probably does understand many things and is able to memorize things. He's aware of details. He can point out things, and they're not used to that. Like, it surprises them sometimes. Even my own brother, my mother and I will comment. My own brother has an observation that we didn't judge he'd be capable of. So he surprises us sometimes with things he knows, and he'll remember things forever. He'll ask me about a friend I had in high school or in elementary school, and I'm like, how? Like, I've forgotten about that person, but he'll ask me. So he's, they just are focused on different things. So this is like, and I said the overlapping conditions like an autism spectrum disorder, similarities and social challenges. There's a famous example. I was surprised about this because it's one of my favorite comedians, Chris Rock. Apparently is a nonverbal learning disorder, and it's had a lifelong impact on his relationships, which he talks about in his show, the issues with his relationships. So I was actually kind of interested that, wow, look at that. And of course, Chris and I don't hang out, but
anymore.
He never would return my calls, or the time I came to his house and knocked on the door, or that one time I showed up in his bedroom. No, I'm kidding.
Oh.
It's going to get views.
I know, right?
So interventions and strategies, we break things into manageable tasks and identify patterns. So you can teach people to do that, to make it more concrete. That would be something you'd learn. You'd have to do with lots of extra learning where most of us could grab on to things very simply. You'd have to learn scripts for social situations. We used to do this with people I worked with in the hospital with schizophrenia, and we'd teach them how to go into the DMV and how to troubleshoot situations. And we had a whole social learning block that was super fun. Like, people loved it because we had people act it out, and then we gave each other critiques and I like people who usually sleep through group. They laughed and were super entertained through these groups. So I used to love doing them. And it was just to teach people skills like how to handle situations, like how to go and place an order. And then when they tell you, like, oh, I'd like a hamburger with no ketchup, and the person says, we don't make it without ketchup. And what do you do? How do you problem solve that? And
what are you, an idiot? No.
And, we would do, I'm not thinking that was one of the examples, but it was stuff like that. It was very simple stuff, like how to problem solve a situation that the rest of us take for granted. No. And do you also notice that people say take for granted, like the stone, as opposed to take for granted?
I have not.
Oh, okay. Well, as long as we're picking on language, that's another one I always notice.
Yeah,
I sometimes notice people say take for granted, like the stone.
Not a tita.
Not granted, yes. Which I'm sloppy with my pronunciation.
I say mountain instead of mountain.
I say mountain with a T, and you say it mountain.
Because I'm from Kansas, so.
Oh, and I used to say pizza. I would say pizza.
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 Yeah, he told me that, and I had never heard that.
Pizza. You should open a pizza store.
With a K.
Well, we all have our things, don't we?
And that's what I was going to go to. I feel like everybody has some sort of neurological brain, something that we need help with.
God,
like
yes.
Everybody in general, like we all need those tools in certain situations. Some people are like socially awkward, just normal by standards, but I feel like we all could use some of those tools.
We all could use it. And also what I loved here is that it's important to recognize and nurture strengths. We don't just work on deficits. We work on nurturing people's strengths. Mm-hmm. And that may be the key to Gus's journey. NVLD or does not limit people's potential. It just highlights the need for tailored interventions. And I found this cool quote. This woman who said, I'm neurodivergent. When I was 14, I was diagnosed with ADHD, OCD, and several learning disorders, including dyscalculia, which is inability to do math. This is Shannon Watts. She's the founder of Gun Safety Groups, the gun safety groups Moms Demand Action, MDA, and Everytown. So, she said, we're not weird, we're wonderful, and we're your family, your friends, and your fellow Americans.
Oh.
So if you want more information about MVLD, there's the MVLD Project at mvld.org or the Child Mind Institute at childmind.org. That wraps up the show for today, folks. Thank you so much. Remember to like, subscribe, give us 5 stars. Links to the studies on the YouTube page. Go to youtube.com/Dr. Greg. And if you have any questions or topics, hit us up on the socials at Ask Dr. Greg. This is Dr. Greg, Brian, and Tony. Bye, guys. Bidding you farewell. Be present, be flexible, and be kind.